Hi, econ students. Welcome to concept 4.6, the last concept of unit 4. We're talking about the loanable funds market. That's right. We just got done with the money market, and now there's a brand new market. And yes, it is kind of confusing. But remember, we've talked about loanable funds before this. We called excess reserves loanable funds and loanable funds excess reserves. So you've already seen kind of what happens on a bank balance sheet with these loanable funds. What we're talking about now is what kind of changes our demand for those loanable funds and our supply of those loanable funds. If you already know what causes increased excess reserves, then you already know what causes the change in the supply of loanable funds. So we actually create a market from this, and it's the demand and supply of loanable funds that create something we call the real interest rate, which you already know and love. So let's get into it. Okay, so what's the graph look like? Well, at the equilibrium, we find the real interest rate for the borrowing of loans based on how many loans are being supplied in the market by banks and lenders and how many loans are being demanded in the market by businesses, consumers, and the government. So first we have the demand. The demand for loans are the borrowers. If you just think about it logically, the people who demand loans are the people who are borrowing money. So oftentimes when we think about borrowing money, we think of consumers, right? We go out and get a loan for a car or a loan for college or a loan for a house. But really, in reality, the major borrowers are not us. The major borrowers or actors are businesses who borrow from major investments because they're borrowing millions and millions of dollars per business, right? The other major borrower, and probably the greatest borrower of all, is the government. You see, everybody has to borrow from the same reserves. So when the government starts borrowing from the market in order to have this massive debt, they're issuing bonds. When they issue bonds, they take excess reserves out of the market. And when they do that, they're they're demanding those excess reserves that could have been accessed by businesses. We call that crowding out. All that to say, there are three borrowers: consumers, businesses, and probably most consequentially, government. Okay? In addition to that, sorry, black myself out there, you have supply. The supply is upward sloping, just like all supply is, because there's an inverse relationship here, or I'm sorry, a direct relationship here. When real interest rates rise, quantity of loan supply goes up because banks and lenders are getting higher funds as a result. So when we think of suppliers, oftentimes we think of banks, right? But really, that's not where the supply of loans comes from. They're the ones that lend it out in order to get profitability. But the supply actually changes based on people like you and me putting money in the bank, and businesses putting money in the bank, and the government putting money in the bank. In fact, all savers are lenders. So when saving changes, it changes supply. Is at the equilibrium where the quantity demanded of loans by the demanders, that inverse relationship on interest rate, right? Where when interest rates lower, they demand more, interest rates are higher, they demand less. And the quantity supplied of lenders that has that direct relationship with interest rate, where when interest rates are high, they supply more, interest rates are low, they supply less. Where those two things collide at equilibrium is where you get real interest rates and the quantity of loans. Now you might be saying, hey, we just talked about the money market, and you said that in the money market, the nominal interest rate is set. And in here, you're talking about the real interest rate. You're smart, right? Nominal interest rate is set in the money market by the Federal Reserve, and the real interest rate is set in the loanable funds market. And those two play together a little bit. There's some interplay. Of course, we know nominal interest rates minus inflation equals real interest rates. We know that, and we know there's some interplay between the Federal Reserve and the change in supply of money and the demand of money and what's actually happening on the bank level. But that's for AP economics, like course number 3. If you get into advanced economics, you'll do that. All you need to know is that loans always use real interest rates. Loans are for real. The Fed is nominal. Loans are for real. Real interest rates right there. Okay. So let's talk about savings and supply. This is the greatest determinant of the supply of loanable funds. So saving, we know, is what makes lending possible. We've seen this. When people put money into the bank, they take some of that and they put it in required reserves. The rest of it is excess reserves, loanable funds. So when people save money, there are more loanable funds. When people save less, there are fewer. We have a couple types of saving. We have private saving. This is just definitional. It's the amount that households, people like you and me, save instead of consume. Remember, there are two things you can do with your income: consume it or save it. Marginal propensity to consume, marginal propensity to save. See how it's all connecting, right? So when we save that money, it goes into the banks and it goes into the excess reserve. So it's increased in the supply of loanable funds. There's public saving. On occasion, when tax revenue comes in, the Federal Reserve will put some of that money into the banks, into savings. That shows up as a supply of loanable funds as well. When you put those two things together, the private and the public, households, businesses, and the government, you get national savings. And when national savings go up or down, you have a change in the supply of loanable funds, which is what it says right there. So to me, that's the easiest thing to remember. Supply, saver, saver, supply, supply, savers. Whenever savings changes, it's a change in the supply of the loanable funds market. Let's take a look here. Let's say the government increases deficit spending. This is the most common question related to the loanable funds market. In fact, I'm convinced that the only reason College Board talks about the loanable funds market is so they can ask this specific question. So we'll deal with this specifically. Deficit spending is when the government is spending money that they don't have. They're going into debt, deficit spending, right? So they're spending money, but they're not raising tax revenue. This is also considered expansionary fiscal policies when the government spends money in fiscal policy, and in fact, is one of the great critiques of fiscal policy, which we'll talk about in a second. When the government does this, how does it affect savings? Hmm. Well, if they're spending all of their money, what are they doing with saving? That's right, they're saving less of it. So savings are going to decrease. Public savings. Supply is going to shift left. When supply shifts left, out. Real interest rates rise. When real interest rates rise, quantity goes down. And you know that whenever interest rates change, investment changes. And that'll come into play here in a little bit. All right. What about foreigners? Can they affect the supply of money or of loanable funds? Of course they can. Otherwise, it wouldn't have a supply that said for or have a slide that says foreigners. So foreigners also lend and they can put money or save money in foreign banks, right? So money enters and leaves our country, enters and leaves our banks all of the time. We have two things you need to know. We have capital inflow. This is the amount of money that's entering our country. It's coming in, it's inflow. The banks are foreign investors are taking their money and putting them in our banks. That increases the supply of money. Then there's capital outflow. When foreigners are nervous about our economy, they don't think it's stable, then that money flees. We call it capital flight. Money leaves the United States, and as a result, there's fewer excess reserves, fewer loanable funds being supplied. Net capital inflow is simply your inflow minus your outflow. So sometimes you'll see that definition up there. So any change in net capital inflow will shift the supply of loanable funds. If net capital inflow goes up, it means there's more flow coming in, supply will go up. If net capital inflow goes down, supply will go down. Not very common, but there it is for you. Okay, what about investment and demand? Well, we know there's a couple of different types of investment. The first is private investment. This is where businesses and individuals like you and me decide that we want to borrow more money so that we can buy our houses and our cars or so that we can build a new factory, right? That increases the demand for loanable funds. Makes sense. And if we are less bullish on the economy and we don't want to buy those cars and those houses or build that factory, the demand will shift left. Government borrowing works kind of the same, right? When there's deficit spending, that means government spending is greater than tax revenue, then demand is going to shift right. They need that money. They get it from somewhere, and it's from those excess reserves, from those loanable funds. So demand goes up. When the government participates in less deficit spending, then demand will go down. So any change in borrowing will affect the demand of loanable funds, right? So, for example, if there's an investment tax credit which says, hey, we'll give you a tax break if you build a factory. Businesses are going to be more likely to build more factories to get that tax credit. So the demand for loanable funds will go up. Okay. Also, another example is we have a recessionary gap and we implement expansionary fiscal policy. So the government comes in and spends a bunch of money that they don't have. When they do that, they demand loanable funds. The demand shifts right. And when the demand shifts right for the loanable funds, real interest rates rise and it crowds out investment. So it looks like this. When the government increases deficit spending, and you're like, wait, hold on, Mr. Lane, isn't that the same example you used before? And didn't you use that to show a shift in supply? Yes, I did. In fact, most of the time, if there's an increase in borrowing, increase in spending, there's a decrease in savings. Remember, there's only two things you can do with money: spend it or save it. So if I spend more, I save less. And if I save more, I spend less, right? They go hand in hand. So most of the time, you can make an argument for either a shift of supply or demand, if that wasn't confusing enough. So just pick one you're comfortable with and you're fine. So the demand for loanable funds will shift to the right when the government increases deficit spending because they're demanding more of those loanable funds. Interest rates rise. When interest rates rise, we call this the crowding out effect. This is the main critique of deficit spending through expansionary fiscal policy. When the government spends money it doesn't have, it pushes interest rates up. When it does that, it crowds out legitimate investment for businesses and for people like you and me because we're like, wait a minute, didn't the interest rate used to be RE? Now it's R1? It's way too high. I'm not going to buy a house. I'm not going to buy a car. I'm not going to build a factory. And so it crowds out potential real investment that can result in economic growth. So we have temporary fixes through expansionary fiscal policy. It gets rid of our recession. But what's the cost? Well, the long term cost might be diminished economic growth in the future. Okay, so here's all the crowding out stuff you need to know. Government deficit spending uses the government spending to try and fix the economy. But when they do that, they create the crowding out of private investment like you and me. Here's why. When the demand for loanable funds goes up because of deficit spending, we just showed you, interest rates go up. And when interest rates rise, gross private domestic investment, IG, falls. And that reduces future economic growth. And vice versa, when I showed you the supply shifting left as the same shifter, or I guess a different shifter, but the same factor, when that happens, interest rates rise as well. And when that happens, gross private domestic investment, or IG, falls, and it robs us of future economic growth. So, like I said just a second ago, this is the central critique of fiscal policy, right? Government debt in itself has its own issues, and that's really a debt to GDP ratio issue. But deficit spending causing crowding out is probably the most legitimate of all of the critiques of fiscal policy. Okay, and like I said, monetary policy, it has other concerns as well, but we're not going to cover those right now. Okay, so what will happen to the supply of loanable funds? There's political or demand and supply. If there's political instability. So if we, for example, don't know the results of an election and it causes riots all over the nation, right? What's going to happen? Well, first, demand and supply are going to shift. Check it out. So demand's going to decrease because people like you and me are worried about the future of the economy. We're going to not buy a new car right now or not buy a new house, right? And businesses are not going to build a new factory because we're nervous about what the future holds. So demand will shift to the left. In addition, supply is going to decrease because foreign nations, remember, they're central savers as well. Foreign nations are nervous, so they're going to pull their money out of this unstable or unstable economy and bring it back in and put it into a more stable investment. But as a result, the supply will shift left as well. Political instability causes something we call capital flight. So what's that look like? It looks like this. Demand shifts left, supply shifts left. Quantity absolutely falls with the loans being exchanged, but interest rates are indeterminate. They went down when demand shifted left, they went up when supply shifted left. Okay, so that is about as complex as it gets. Let me put it into a chart form for you, for those of you that like to put charts in your notes. These are the shifters of the loanable funds market. You need to know them. Demand shifters is a change in perceived business opportunities. If I think the future is bright, we're going to demand more. If I'm worried about the future, we're going to demand less for loanable funds. Changes in government borrowing. This is huge. Deficit spending. There's more deficit spending, demand shifts right. There's less deficit spending, demand shifts left, right? That means Budget deficits, budget surpluses indicate our changes in borrowing. So if there's a huge budget surplus, then we're borrowing less. Demand shifts left. If there's a huge budget deficit, means we're going into debt, we're borrowing more, demand shifts right. On the other side, we have our supply shifters. Any change in private savings or public savings behavior is going to change the supply curve. We talked about that already. And then, of course, changes in foreign investment, that capital inflow or that capital outflow, also impact the supply. And then finally, any changes in expected profitability for investment, right? If I expect to be able to make more money by putting my money in the bank, then I'm going to supply more money into the market. And then finally, remember this green one over here, the change in government borrowing, that can also be used as a supply shifter as well. Because if they're spending money, they're not saving money. Okay, that's it for the final concept. I know that's a little bit dense. I'll emphasize the things you absolutely need to know tomorrow in class. I will see you soon. Peace to you and yours.